The first thing that hit the alien students when they entered the Earth Exchange Program headquarters wasn't the scent of fresh coffee or the buzz of human conversation. It was the sheer chaos. Tables were cluttered with devices and papers. Humans talked over each other, and somewhere in the back, a machine screeched in protest. For Isik, who came from the meticulously ordered planet of Vihar, it was a sensory nightmare. Still, orders were orders. Learn from the humans, understand their ways, report back. Isik adjusted the translator node embedded in his neck folds and followed the rest of his cohort deeper into the building. The guide, a woman named Jenna Fairbanks, who wore a perpetually distracted expression, waved them toward a wide-open training hall. "All right," Jenna said, tossing a clipboard onto a bench. "Today you're shadowing our emergency response drills. Don't worry, it's all simulated. Nobody gets hurt." At that exact moment, a loud crash echoed from the far end of the hall. Isik and the others turned their heads in unison. A man in a navy blue training uniform had plowed through a stack of metal lockers. He staggered backward, blood already blooming across his forearm, a deep gash visible even from across the room. The alien students froze, horrified. The man, however, muttered something under his breath, wiped his forehead with the uninjured hand, and casually walked over to a wall-mounted cabinet. He yanked it open, revealing a battered first aid kit, and began pulling out gauze like he was fixing a jammed printer. "That's Frank Jensen," Jenna said, chewing her gum. "One of our senior trainers." Frank didn't look senior. He looked like he was about 2 minutes from passing out. Isik shifted uncomfortably, his 4 fingers twitching near his data pad. "Should we not summon assistance?" he asked, voice thick through the translator. Frank overheard and chuckled, though it came out more like a pained grunt. "I'm fine, just a scratch." The gash was anything but a scratch. Blood trickled down his elbow and dripped onto the floor with soft, wet plops. Frank ripped open an alcohol wipe with his teeth and began cleaning the wound, his face tightening as the sting hit. "Should we not immobilize him?" another alien Pell asked, his skin flushing a nervous green. "Relax," Jenna said. "Frank knows what he's doing." Frank, meanwhile, wrapped his arm in gauze, then applied pressure with a belt he pulled off his waist. Only then did he sit down on the floor, his back against the lockers, breathing heavily. "Maybe," he admitted, voice thin, "maybe call the nurse, just in case." Isik exchanged glances with Pell and the others. This was the species they were supposed to learn from. Jenner radioed for medical, and within minutes a woman in scrubs jogged in, a portable scanner in hand. She knelt by Frank, scanning the wound. "No bone involvement," she announced. "You sliced through some muscle, though. You're not walking this one off," Frank chuckled weakly. "Figured." Isik edged closer, fascinated despite himself. "You are in pain," he said carefully. Frank tilted his head. "Yeah, hurts like hell." "And yet you retrieved your own medical supplies and began treatment unaided." Frank shrugged and winced immediately. "Better than bleeding out, right?" Isik recorded that, making a note. "Humans, when injured, prioritize immediate self-care even if compromised." The nurse cleaned and wrapped Frank's arm properly, then helped him to his feet. He swayed but managed to stay upright. "We're gonna stitch you up properly at the infirmary," she said. Frank nodded. "Lead the way." As he shuffled out, Jenna turned back to the group. "So, any questions?" Several alien hands shot up. Isik lowered his, deciding instead to follow quietly. He wanted to see more. The infirmary was a small, sterile room filled with faint smells of antiseptic and something burnt. Frank sat on the examination table, his face paler now. A doctor, a stocky man with thick glasses, examined the arm under bright lights. "You're lucky," the doctor said. "Could have been worse. We'll numb you up and stitch it closed." Frank nodded wearily. "Go for it." Isik and Pell stood in the corner observing. The doctor injected a local anesthetic into the wound area, and Frank flinched but didn't complain. "You have sustained a significant injury," Isik said, stepping closer. "Why were you so casual in your response?" Frank offered a tired grin. "Because freaking out doesn't help. Had to stop the bleeding first." But the pain, Frank shrugged again, more carefully this time. Pain's just the body's way of telling you something's wrong. You listen, but you don't have to throw a fit about it. Pell scribbled furiously on his pad. The doctor, humming a tuneless song under his breath, began stitching. The needle passed through Frank's skin with neat, practiced motions. Isaac watched, fascinated and slightly nauseated. "How long will the recovery take?" Isaac asked. The doctor glanced up. "Few weeks. Maybe 4 to 6, assuming no infection. He'll have to keep it clean, no heavy lifting." Frank sighed. "There goes my weekend." "You should be thankful," Isaac said. "On Vihar, such wounds often require limb replacement." Frank laughed, then winced. "I'll stick with stitches, thanks." Once patched up, Frank was given a sling and a packet of antibiotics. He signed some paperwork with his uninjured hand, then turned to the alien students. "You guys learn anything today?" he asked. Pell nodded briskly. "Humans exhibit rapid adaptation to traumatic injury conditions." Frank chuckled. "Sure, let's call it that." Jenner reappeared holding a clipboard. "Change of plans. Since Frank's out of commission, you'll be shadowing another trainer for the rest of the week." Frank made a face. "Aw, come on, I can still teach." The doctor rolled his eyes. "You can teach from a chair, maybe." Frank lifted his good hand in a mock salute. Challenge accepted. Isaac watched him carefully. The human's resilience wasn't bravado, it was a blend of necessity, stubbornness, and humor. A coping mechanism, maybe, or just how they survived. 2 days later, Frank returned to the training hall, arm still in a sling. He sat on a folding chair near the exit, barking instructions to the new recruits. "Keep your heads down. Move like you mean it." Isaac and Pell observed from the sidelines, noting the slight changes in Frank's demeanor. He was slower, more cautious, but still unmistakably engaged. During a break, Isaac approached him. "You continue to instruct despite your injury." Frank shrugged. "Can't just sit around doing nothing, drives me nuts." "You endanger your healing process," Frank grinned. "Not if I'm careful." Isaac hesitated, then asked, "What drives you to persist despite disadvantage?" Frank thought about it for a moment. "Pride maybe, duty, or maybe I'm just stubborn." Pell interjected, "Observation. Human stubbornness may be an evolutionary advantage." Frank laughed. "You're not wrong." Just then, a recruit tripped over a hurdle and landed hard on his wrist. He cried out, clutching it. Frank struggled to his feet, hurrying over with his one good arm. "Easy, kid, don't move it." He knelt awkwardly, inspecting the wrist without touching it. "Jenna, get the med team," he shouted. Isaac watched in fascination as Frank improvised a splint using a rolled-up magazine and some athletic tape, keeping the injured wrist stable until help arrived. This time, Frank didn't try to handle it all himself. He stayed with the recruit, offering steady reassurance until the medics arrived. Later, after the injured recruit was taken away, Isaac approached Frank again. "You adapted your response," Isaac said. "You sought assistance rather than acting alone." Frank nodded. "Sometimes you gotta know when you can't do it all yourself." Isaac recorded that too. Humans were resilient, yes. But their true strength, he realized, was knowing when to rely on each other. The sun had barely dragged itself up over the horizon when Isaac found himself back at the emergency training hall, clutching his datapad like a shield. Human schedules, he had learned, were merciless. There was no solar alignment ceremony, no preparatory meditation, just a blaring alarm and a rush to action. Frank was already there, seated in his folding chair, sling still in place, a battered thermos balanced precariously on his knee. He waved Isaac and Pell over with his free hand. "Morning, aliens," he said, voice rough from sleep. Pell blinked rapidly, his species equivalent of a wary salute. Isaac just nodded, still not entirely convinced greeting rituals were necessary before full cognitive function had been achieved. Frank pointed toward the center of the hall where a mock disaster scene had been set up overnight. A mangled car frame, fake smoke, shards of plastic scattered across the floor. Several human recruits in torn clothing moaned dramatically from their positions in the wreckage. "Today," Frank said, "you're going to see how we handle multi-casualty incidents." Isaac tilted his head. All injuries are simulated, mostly, Frank said, unless someone screws up real bad. He sipped from his thermos, grimacing. Coffee's terrible today, Pell whispered. What is coffee? Frank grinned. Legal stimulant, keeps us upright when we should be horizontal. Without further preamble, Frank blew a loud whistle and the recruits sprang into action. Medics rushed forward, triage tags flying from their belts, shouting rapid assessments. Isaac watched, antennae rigid with focus. A woman knelt by a trapped victim, her hands moving quickly to stabilize a mock broken leg. Another team set up a portable shelter, shielding a bleeding man from the imaginary hazards. Isaac moved closer to Frank. You simulate catastrophic events regularly. Yeah, Frank said. You don't want the first time to be the real time. Pell edged closer, scribbling notes. Isn't frequent exposure to simulated trauma detrimental to mental stability? Frank chuckled dryly. Maybe. But it's better than freezing up when it counts. A loud crash interrupted them. One of the recruits had tripped over the fake wreckage, landing hard on his side. The hall fell silent for a beat before the recruit groaned. Frank pushed himself upright with effort. Stay here, he said, limping toward the fallen man. Isaac and Pell followed at a respectful distance. The recruit clutched his ankle, face twisted in pain. Frank crouched awkwardly, his injured arm useless, and inspected the joint with his good hand. Looks swollen, Frank muttered. Can you move your toes? The recruit wiggled them, wincing. Good sign, Frank said. Might just be a sprain. Frank signaled for a stretcher, then pulled a strip of elastic bandage from a pouch on his belt, deftly wrapping the ankle to immobilize it. Isaac leaned closer. You carry medical supplies personally? Frank shrugged. Better to have it and not need it. The medics arrived with the stretcher, lifting the recruit carefully. Frank straightened with a grunt, rubbing his good shoulder. All right, he said, turning to the aliens. Any observations? Pell nodded. You displayed immediate intervention despite personal injury. Frank wiped his forehead with his sleeve. Wouldn't leave him lying there just cause my arms busted. Isaac tapped a note into his pad. Assessment: human prioritization of group safety over individual limitation. Frank smiled faintly. Teamwork's not optional when you're bleeding. The day dragged on, the simulations growing more elaborate. By mid-afternoon, Isaac's brain felt like it had been wrung out and left in the sun, yet the humans showed no signs of slowing. During a lull, Frank waved Isaac and Pell over to a supply table laden with bandages, splints, and strange devices with flashing lights. Time for hands-on practice, he said. Isaac stiffened. On what subjects? Frank laughed. Each other. It's safer if you learn before someone's actually dying. He tossed a roll of gauze to Pell, who fumbled it. Isaac caught a triangular bandage, examining it with suspicion. Frank demonstrated how to sling an arm with one hand, his movements practiced despite the real sling immobilizing his own. You never know when you'll be the only one standing, he said. Isaac tried to replicate the motion on Pell, who resigned himself to being a patient. The bandage ended up more like a tangled scarf. Frank winced dramatically. If Pell actually needed help, he'd be a goner. Isaac hissed through his teeth. Your anatomical structures are unnecessarily complex, Frank chuckled. Tell me about it. The second attempt went better, if slightly lopsided. Frank gave an approving grunt. Good enough for field work. You're not making art, you're stopping the bleeding. A sharp buzzer blared from overhead, signaling the end of drills for the day. Recruits slumped against walls, stripping off gloves and helmets, some laughing, others too tired to speak. Frank dropped heavily back into his chair, cradling his injured arm. Lines of exhaustion carved deeper into his face. Isaac hesitated, then asked, Does this constant exposure to simulated disaster not deteriorate your psychological integrity? Frank considered that, swirling the dregs of his terrible coffee. Maybe, but better a little frayed than dead. Pell scribbled frantically. Frank glanced at their pads. You guys writing a book or something? Isaac clicked his mandibles softly. We are compiling a behavioral analysis. Frank laughed aloud. Hope you're painting a flattering picture. Isaac blinked. Objective accuracy is prioritized over aesthetic embellishment. Frank muttered something about aliens having no sense of humor. Isaac wasn't sure if that was an insult or a compliment. Later, as the hall emptied out, Frank gestured for Isaac and Pell to follow him outside. The evening air was crisp, the sky painted in streaks of orange and purple. Frank leaned against the wall, watching the recruits drift toward the dormitories. "You know," he said, "it's not just about patching wounds or dragging people out of wrecks." Isaac tilted his head, encouraging him to continue. "It's about not giving up when everything goes sideways," Frank said. "You train for the worst not because you want it to happen, but because you know it might." Pell nodded slowly, absorbing the words. Isaac tapped a quiet note. "Human resilience is proactive, not reactive." Frank glanced at the setting sun. "You ever see a building collapse?" Isaac shook his head. Frank's face grew distant. "I have. Was 19, New York, gas explosion. I was just walking by and suddenly." Rubble, screaming, dust so thick you couldn't see your own hands. Isaac waited, sensing this wasn't a story he told often. "I pulled 3 people out before the firefighters got there," Frank said. "Didn't think about it, just moved." Pell asked, "Were you injured?" Frank flexed his good hand. "Couple broken ribs, worth it." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the chirping of nocturnal creatures. Frank pushed off the wall with a grunt. "All right, aliens, time to hit the mess hall. Hope you like mystery meat." Isaac exchanged glances with Pell. Neither understood what mystery meat entailed, but both suspected it would be educational. As they followed Frank toward the cafeteria, Isaac added one final note to his report: humans do not fear chaos. They carry it with them and somehow, through a combination of stubbornness, humor, and sheer will, turn it into survival. Isaac found human cafeterias almost as perplexing as their emergency drills. The noise was a steady roar, punctuated by the clatter of trays and the low buzz of tired conversation. The air smelled heavily of fried oils and something unidentifiable but aggressive. Pell hesitated at the entrance, eyeing the crowd as if expecting an ambush. Frank, still cradling his injured arm against his torso, nudged them forward with his elbow. "Come on, you can't study us on an empty stomach." Isaac selected a tray with tongs, wary of touching anything directly. Pell followed suit, his antennae drooping suspiciously. They shuffled along the line behind Frank, who grabbed a plate piled high with steaming, meat-like substances and a side of pale, limp vegetables. "You ever had meatloaf?" Frank asked, jabbing his fork at the mound. Isaac stared at it. "Is it composed of multiple biological entities?" Frank laughed, nearly dropping his fork. "Probably. You get used to it." Isaac chose a small serving of rice and something labeled vegetarian surprise, which looked marginally safer. Pell opted for a bowl of clear broth, sniffing it cautiously. They found a corner table away from the worst of the chaos. Frank sat heavily, setting his tray down with a grunt. The sling across his chest restricted his movements, forcing him to eat left-handed. "You adapt to injury even during basic sustenance activities," Isaac observed, poking at his rice. Frank chewed thoughtfully. "Gotta eat. Body needs fuel to heal, can't just lay around waiting to feel better." Pell dipped a spoon into his broth. "You consume solid and liquid nutrition simultaneously," Frank grinned. "Multitasking, it's a survival skill." Pell scribbled a brief note, then tasted the broth. His expression flickered between confusion and mild betrayal. Frank chuckled. "Yeah, not everything here's gourmet." Isaac took a cautious bite of his rice. It was bland but edible. The vegetarian surprise remained untouched, radiating a suspicious, waxy sheen under the overhead lights. Pell cleared his throat. "Do humans possess regenerative capabilities beyond baseline healing?" Frank wiped his mouth with a napkin. "Not like you're thinking. We can't grow back limbs or anything, but we can recover from a lot. Broken bones, torn muscles, even some organ damage if you catch it early." Isaac tapped his tablet lightly. "What methods enhance this recovery?" Frank shrugged. "Good food, rest, medicine when you need it, sometimes surgery." Pell's antennae twitched. Surgical intervention involves mechanical alteration of internal structures, pretty much, Frank said. You get hurt bad enough, they open you up and fix what's broken, stitch you back together like a busted pair of jeans. Isaac considered that. You willingly allow invasive procedures. If it keeps you alive, yeah, Frank said, scooping up another forkful of meatloaf. Fear's natural, but it doesn't stop us. A loud clang drew their attention. Across the room, a tray had slipped from a recruit's hands, scattering food across the floor. No one panicked. A janitor immediately appeared with a mop, whistling a jaunty tune as he cleaned the mess. Frank smiled. You see that? Disaster, minor as it is, and nobody freaks out. We clean it up and move on. Isaac nodded slowly. Resilience is integrated into social behavior. Exactly, Frank said. You learn to roll with it. By the time they finished eating, the cafeteria had thinned out. Frank struggled briefly with his tray, finally balancing it on his good hand. Let's take a walk, he said. Stretch the legs. Outside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of damp earth. The training compound sprawled under the darkening sky, lights flickering on along the pathways. Frank led them toward a small courtyard where a few off-duty personnel lounged on benches or jogged slow laps around a circular track. Some wore heavy braces or bandages, moving with the careful stiffness of the recently injured. Pell observed them intently. Injury is common among your emergency personnel, Frank nodded. Comes with the territory, you train hard, you push limits, sometimes you get hurt. But you learn something every time. Isaac glanced at a woman jogging past, her knee heavily wrapped. Repeated exposure to physical trauma does not deter participation. If anything, it makes you tougher, Frank said. You figure out what you're made of, Pell frowned. Is there no threshold where you cease activity permanently? Frank leaned against a low wall, stretching his good leg. Sure, sometimes injuries are bad enough that you have to stop, but even then people find other ways to contribute. Teaching, planning, counseling. Isaac tapped his pad. Adaptation extends beyond physical recovery to role reassignment, Frank grinned. Now you're getting it. A medic jogged past, offering Frank a quick two-fingered salute. Frank returned it with a nod. You ever hear of calluses? Frank asked suddenly. Isaac shook his head. Frank held up his hand, showing thickened patches on his palm. You use something enough, your body reinforces it, skin gets tougher. Same thing happens inside in a way. Psychological callousing, Pell said, antennae perking. Exactly, Frank said. You take the hits, you build up. They sat for a while, watching the slow rhythms of evening life. A group of recruits played a loose game of catch with a battered football, laughing as the ball skidded across the grass. Frank sighed contentedly. This, he said, is how you stay sane. You train hard, you hurt sometimes, you deal with it, but you also make time to breathe. Isaac closed his pad, satisfied. You balance preparation for disaster with cultivation of normalcy. Frank chuckled. Man, you make it sound fancy, we just call it living. Pell watched the football skitter across the courtyard again. Would participation aid our understanding? Frank raised an eyebrow. You want to play? Isaac hesitated. Is physical collision involved? Only if you're bad at catching, Frank said, pushing off the wall. Come on, I'll show you. He waved to the group, who tossed the ball toward them. Frank caught it one-handed, wincing slightly. All right, he said, tossing it gently to Pell. Try it. Pell caught it awkwardly, nearly toppling backward. Isaac suppressed a chitter of amusement. Not bad, Frank said. Now throw it back. Pell flung the ball with too much force. It sailed over Frank's head, bouncing off a nearby bench. Frank laughed. All right, maybe we start with basics. They spent the next half hour practicing simple throws, the aliens growing marginally more coordinated with each attempt. Frank coached them patiently, offering corrections without mockery. As the sky deepened into true night, Frank finally called a halt. Not bad for your first try, he said, rubbing his arm, and nobody dislocated a shoulder. Bonus. Isaac felt an unfamiliar lightness in his thorax. Perhaps this chaotic resilience was not merely tolerance of injury, but an active cultivation of strength through shared experience. They walked back toward the dormitories together, the courtyard behind them now quiet and still. At the entrance, Frank paused. "You're doing good," he said. "Not just the throwing, the whole learning thing." Isaac inclined his head. "Your instruction is effective." Frank grinned, then winced as the motion pulled at his sling. "Gonna take that as a compliment." Pell tapped his pad lightly. "We will compile today's observations into our report." Frank waved a lazy goodbye as he limped toward his quarters. "Just make sure you spell my name right." Inside the dormitory, Isaac and Pell reviewed their notes before retiring for the night. Their report would detail the human capacity for resilience, their adaptability under duress, and the curious way they wove recovery into the fabric of daily life. As Isaac powered down his pad, he reflected that true strength was not the absence of harm, but the refusal to let harm define you. And in that, humans were nothing short of extraordinary.